Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is your AP World History teacher, Ben Osborne. We're looking here a little bit at Unit 5, Industrial Revolution. As I probably already mentioned to you, the way the College Board does this is strange. That whole Unit 5 is really like a little bit about some of the political enlightenment and political revolutions, but it is a lot about industrial revolution. So we actually have quite a few slides here. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I don't really want to do like a 30-minute video. I feel like the longer you do it, the more likely it is that people are going to tune out. So let me shut up and go ahead and get to work. All right, so let's check it out. Unit 5, Industrial Revolution. This is 5.3 to 5.10, which is also hilarious. All right, let's check it out. So first off, Industrial Revolution beginnings here. These are changes associated with the industrialization of production. All right, both social and economic, change in the nature of work, which is no longer human or animal. So for most of human history, we have a situation where work is going to be based upon human or animal muscle energy. Now we are going to be able to use things like coal, etc., to try to drive those things instead. Prior to this, we had some water, kind of water power, a little bit of wind power. I mean, obviously, like sailing is wind power, but not as much of this as what you would think. Earlier in Britain, families made most of what they needed. That's going to be that manorial system we talked about during the Middle Ages. Later on, kind of a transition period, we're going to see that this thing called the cottage or putting out industry. People brought things to your house for you to make. So they would bring you some cloth, you turn them into shirts or something, and then you would give them back out again. New power sources are going to shift work to large factories instead. So you can't really have a big steam engine at your house. So in order to do that, to use the steam engines and use the industrialization properly, you're going to need to build them in other places. And so that is why we start having these large factories. Here you can see how industrialization is going on all over Great Britain. It's not just in one location. Some of the major cities, of course, London, and then a bit up there in the north, places like Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, etc. All right, what are the causes, though, of this industrial revolution? Well, we got a couple of different things, okay? So this is going to be a couple slides here talking a bit about interlocking reasons. These also are not like one thing then the other. A lot of the causations we talk about are like this happened and then this happened. But in reality, these are all going on around the same time period. So one would be the agricultural revolution. This is usually known as the second agricultural revolution. Some of the new technology that's going on in this time period is going to lead to increased food production and therefore increased population. A good example of this would be the seed drill. This was a machine that you drag behind a horse or a tractor, and it planted seeds deep in the ground, which allowed for better production of the plants you're looking for. We also have some new technology and innovations or inventions. So for example, the spinning jenny and the water frame are going to be examples of things in textiles. They're going to make textiles faster and cheaper to produce. And that will also, again, allow the creation of the factory system. The water frame needed like a river next to the building. So unless you live next to a river, you couldn't do that. So that's why it kind of supplanted or got rid of that putting out system. The steam engine then later on created by James Watt will take the place of some of these water factories. And then also steamships will be important for transporting all the goods that you're making. Another thing here that's going on is the idea of interchangeable parts, which is created by Eli Whitney of the Cotton Gin fame. Basically, parts prior to this time varied a bit, like they would be somewhat similar to each other, but if you wanted something done, you had to take it to a specialized person. A great example of this, and one of the examples that Whitney used for interchangeable parts, is going to be the like rifles or guns. So you would have like made on a model, like you would make them similar to each other, but like each of the triggers or whatever are going to be slightly different from each other. So if you wanted to get it repaired, the gunsmith could take a trigger that would fit, but then you'd have to shave little parts off and move it around or whatever. So it was a skilled action. The interchangeable parts, though, makes it so that every single one is exactly the same. You pull out the old trigger, you put a new one in, done. Not a problem, going to make it a lot quicker. But this does lead to a division of labor among workers because of the ease of manufacture and repair. And that leads to things like the assembly line, where people did essentially one thing over and over and over again. Here's two examples of some of these machines we're talking about. That top left one up there is going to be the spinning jenny. You can see the wheel there, and then you see all the little spindles and bobbins and things. Essentially, if you think of like what like a Rumpelstiltskin style or a Cinderella style spinning wheel, you had one big wheel, and then you would have one thing of thread. Here, this woman can run all those different bobbins of thread, like 12 or something like that. That is going to be a lot more efficient and easy. But again, you can see how big this machine is. It was very expensive to create. You had to have special specialized knowledge to build the frame and stuff, which means it was best to put into a factory. Now, right here next to me in my head is going to be the water frame, a similar concept, but instead of having the woman using her arm to do that, you can see this little thing here right next to me. That is going to be a belt-driven system that is connected to some kind of water system, like a water pump or something like that, that's going to be able to generate the power that you need. All right, causes of industrialization continued here. Population growth. This is tied into that agricultural revolution of the 1700s. We got crop rotation, that seed drill we already talked about. That's going to increase the amount of food. We also have these new calories from the New World. So, for example, potatoes. Okay, so as potatoes come in, they're going to be easier to plant in certain locations. They're going to be able to increase the amount of calories people have and make things a little better for everybody. There's also new types of medical care and the advancement of science, such as the Broad Street Pump, which I will tell you about in a second when we get to the next slide. Urbanization is also going to be a big factor here. We have this thing called the enclosure movement of the 18th century, which led more and more people to the cities. Okay, so what happens basically is that people used to be able to they're kind of like small scale, like pigs or chicken farming or whatever. They would be allowed to sort of let those animals roam. Like this isn't like a giant, 1,000 pig thing or whatever. It's like your family has like 2 pigs and you let them go in the morning and they go like eat people's trash and acorns or whatever, right? But what happens then is that people start getting unhappy with this. They start to enclose the land, not allowing those animals instead to go to those lands. And that means that more and more people have difficulty surviving in the countryside. So they start moving to the cities. Big examples of this might be Liverpool and Manchester. These are going to become major industrial towns. This is an example of that medical technology, this thing called the Broad Street Pump. This is in London. You can see, actually it still exists if you want to go check it out. If you're in London, you can see it. That over there on the left is the Broad Street Pump. Basically, if you look at this map up above me here, Broad Street's kind of dead there in the middle where all the kind of darker looking kind of squares and rectangles are. Basically, back then, you used to get your water from these pumps, especially if you were in the poorer parts of town. So they had like municipal pumps. You'd show up there in the morning, you'd pump your water, take it back in a pail or whatever, and then use it for whatever you needed. But in this little area, there was a real problem with a disease called cholera. And so this scientist, this doctor named Jon Snow, not of Game of Thrones, decided to try to figure out what was going on, why they had so much cholera in this area. And it turns out that that he does a epidemiological study. He goes around to everybody and he creates this map that you're looking at, where he determines where do people have this disease. And it turns out, if you look at it all, it's basically centered right there around Broad Street. So he sure enough goes to the Broad Street Pump, he tests it, it has cholera, and so they are able to bleach it and all that kind of stuff, kill all the cholera, and then people ended up returning in a much healthier situation. So this is an example of sort of early, simple, basic scientific studies that we're going to kind of build upon to try to create better and safer healthcare outcomes. We can see this in the recent pandemic as a good example of that. All right, Britain is the first to industrialize. Why? A couple reasons. First off, it's got a good location, lots of water and sea lanes. The import and export was pretty easy for them. Next up, we got natural resources. They have tons and tons of coal and iron. Third, they got capital, money. They have easy to gather money. That money is largely from the slave trade, but it's also from other types of trade as well. We also have transport, good ships and locations of rivers. And lastly, very importantly, protection of private property and a stable government to help keep things going, these laws, okay? Now, if you look around, you'll see lots of examples of places that have similar things, but not quite. So like if you look at like Russia at the time, lots of natural resources, right? Stuff like that, pretty good rivers, but they don't have powerful laws for private property. They don't have a good location because they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, right? And you can see that with Germany, you can see that with America, etc. That as those countries are more similar to Britain, then they are going to be more quickly able to do this kind of thing. Here's a good example of all the navigable rivers here. This is London, and it's a map of its navigable rivers. Supposedly you're never more than like 5 miles away from a navigable river that you can use to transport goods in Britain. All right, technology continued here. Lots of technology we're going to talk about here. Coal again, revolutionary new power source. Steam engine by James Watt is going to use that coal. Steamships will lead to the expansion of European navies. That's going to be very important in Unit 6, which we're going to get to very soon. And the desire of nations for coaling stations to fuel those ships are going to lead to the expansion even more of these European navies. New iron technology will improve the quality of iron. So Henry Cort creates this thing called wrought iron. They changed the formula a little bit of iron, which allows it to be twisted and moved. So you can create, like, it's not as stiff, so you're able to create new shapes with it. So you could create even more, elaborate structures like buildings and stuff like that. Next up, we have this thing known as the Second Industrial Revolution. This basically, there's a brief lull sort of in the 1860s or so, and that leads to a new revolution where we have things like steel, chemicals, machines, electronics. Oil will become important for fuel, electricity allowed for phones, radio, and telegraphs. Again, the big difference between first and second is that the first industrial revolution primarily centered around things like coal or water production, around things like textiles or kind of basic stuff like that. Second industrial revolution is really a lot about oil, and it's also a lot about communications technologies like phones, radios, telegraphs, etc. You can see a little bit of this here, a visual summary of that second industrial revolution. Development of steel and oil industries, expansion of railroads, larger factories, massive profits for business tycoons. Again, it's basically just more, right? More of everything. New forms of business organization, advances in transportation, so forth and so on. One thing, though, you'll see there on the left, third one down, difficult conditions for industrial workers, which is something we're going to get to in just a minute, kind of prefacing that whole issue. All right, now, it doesn't just stay in Britain, of course, it's going to spread. So part of the spread was location. In other words, how close are you to Britain to kind of like copy this? Another example, though, is also how similar you are with Britain, as we mentioned before. So France, for example, not as heavily urbanized, so that slowed them down a bit. And Germany didn't have a strong government until the late 1870s or so. Belgium, being somewhat similar, is going to industrialize somewhat early. The United States, while we're not sort of physically close to Britain, we're pretty close to them sort of, culturally, I guess. So that is going to help us out a bit. We have vast natural resources, good railroad transportation. We also are going to get a lot of migrants from Europe in this period to help create a willing labor force. Japan and Russia will also industrialize in this period, but they're going to do so later. And in the case of Russia in particular, a bit less successfully. Little map here to show you kind of where everything's going on, like the patterns you see here. Again, 1840s or so for Britain, got 1850s, 1860s. It's going to spread basically based upon proximity. All right, let's look around the world then. We're not just going to be looking in Europe because it does spread a bit around the world. And the way that we see people react to this, like how they deal with it, is going to be a big indicator in how they're going to do in the near future. So, for example, we have the Ottomans, all right? So the Ottomans proper, which is meaning like the, Turkey, the Istanbul, all that kind of stuff, they are going to have a problem with corruption. They have issues with ethnic nationalism, which prevents them from capitalizing upon some of the resources. And they have some inherent conservatism from these Islamic scholars, the ulama, which will lead them to not adopt the ideas of the Industrial Revolution in any sort of major way whatsoever. However, we do have an example, sort of in the Ottoman Empire, that clears this up. Okay, in Egypt, right, which was a part of the Ottomans technically, but not really. It had gained independence over time. The Ottomans will send new forces to take control of it, and instead, this Albanian officer who took over, whose name is Muhammad Ali, really becomes the de facto ruler of Egypt. So the Ottomans send a new force led by Ali, but instead of bringing Egypt under the Ottomans, he really just sort of like keeps it for himself, essentially. But when he becomes the new de facto ruler of Egypt, he will modernize on the European model and nationalize lands, and he will also promote factories all throughout his little kingdom there, and he'll make enormous sums during the Napoleonic Wars, selling cotton and textiles to other places. So here's an example, like kind of almost within the same empire, of success and failure. We have failure of the Ottoman central government to actually take advantage of this, but we have an example from the outskirts of the Ottomans in Egypt, where they are going to take advantage of it. That's Muhammad Ali over there on the left. Again, not the boxer, no real relation whatsoever. If you go to Egypt, you will notice they have tons of stuff about him there. He's very, very popular, and people talk about him a lot. Kind of like almost a founding father, kind of like a George Washington of modern Egypt, not like ancient Egypt, but modern Egypt. And you can see over there on the right a little map that indicates the size of his domains by the time of his death. I think the lighter green, that kind of middle green, is the farthest he got during his life, but subsequently they expanded it just a little bit. All right, let's take a look at Japan. Now, Japan had been in isolation since the 1600s under this Tokugawa dynasty. But in the process of doing that, they had really fallen into a technological stagnation. Like, 1600, the highest military technology is a samurai sword. 1850s, the highest technology is also a samurai sword. So they have not really done anything for a couple hundred years as far as technology. America came looking for trade, and Commodore Matthew Perry, who was sent by the United States, forced the Japanese to trade in 1853. The Japanese at this point realized they had messed up in a big way, and so the Japanese oligarchs overthrew the shogunate and began the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So the Meiji Restoration will then attempt to kind of catch up to the Europeans as quickly as possible. And within about 30 years or so, they do a pretty darn good job. Meiji officials will tour Europe and kind of take what they liked. So this is why Japan has kind of an interesting system. Even today, while it's been rebuilt after the war, it still has some of those things, but they're able to take like Prussian model government. They took railroad systems from other places. They like the idea of industrial subsidies. So they could essentially kind of take the best of whatever it is they wanted in order to turn themselves into sort of a mega Voltron of different parts of the Industrial Revolution. One of my favorite things about this whole situation is the perspectives of Japanese upon Americans. So this is, the guy right here next to me is supposed to be Commodore Matthew Perry. He is drawn in the style of sort of a traditional Japanese monster. That's why he looks kind of strange. Up there at the top left, that is their ship, which you can see is filled with like crazy, creepy monsters and faces, and it looks like it's on fire and stuff. The Japanese were not big fans of the Europeans coming in at that time. All right, we're getting there, almost there. All right, economic developments then. So all this industrialization and stuff is going to lead to some brand new types of economic developments. Giant corporations were formed, which allowed for stockholders in the stock market. These things had existed before, but now they're going to be in a bigger way than they ever have been. Some of the companies formed monopolies. So for example, Alfred Krupp in the Bessemer process will form Krupp Steel, which is a big major steel manufacturer in Germany and Austria. One thing we're going to see is new transnational corporations. This is something that is not unfamiliar to us today. I feel like most of our corporations today are transnational, but back then that's different. These are going to be companies that crossed national boundaries. They had, headquarters or groups in different parts of the world. One example of this guy, Cecil Rhodes, is a British citizen in Africa, but he will found the De Beers Diamonds Corporation, which basically controls all the diamonds and actually still does. He wanted to create new railroads for better transportation. A couple of other good examples of early transnational corporations. These are ones that are actually listed in the CED. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Baking Corporation, it still exists. It's usually it's HSBC, I think is what you'll see. There's a couple of little tiny branches of this near where I live, but you'll find tons of them in like New York and like big cities. Unilever then will create a household goods company, primarily through the building of soap or creating of soap, but all kinds of other stuff. They own tons of brands today, huge company today. And then lastly, United Fruit, which is the people who are going to create a bunch of bananas. They are also going to dominate and control lots of Central American countries as well in order to provide those bananas. Now let's look at some effects of the Industrial Revolution. How is it affecting everyday people? Families. So one thing is that on the farm, everybody's pretty close-knit, right? They're seeing each other all the time. Now all of a sudden everyone leaves in the morning. Nobody sees each other again. We're going to start to see children in factories. They had previously worked on the farms. The expectation is they would work as well, and the factories are where they work. So this is going to lead to a lot of danger and a lot of difficulty for them. Cities then, crowding is caused by urbanization in these cities. Tenements and slums will cause major problems also. Tenements, again, are kind of crowded areas where people have to move into. This is going to lead to disease and other issues. Lastly, then class here. New classes will emerge. So we're going to see the working class on the very bottom. These are what we might call blue-collar workers. These are people who work with their hands, putting things together on assembly lines. Another example of this would be white-collar jobs. So you need people to direct and control those people who are working on the factory lines. And we start to see a division. Previously, even if you worked at like not a factory so much, but if you worked in a business, you worked pretty closely with your employees. There was less separation of that. But we're going to start to see that more and more. And these are going to be what we call, and then also the creation of people who are not nobles, but they have enough money to basically be nobles. And these folks are called captains of industry. Here's an example of some of the conditions you might face. You can see all the belts and things, not particularly safe. Lots of crowded, lots of women kind of all jammed together. Again, it's interesting too, the gender aspect of this. Textiles are traditionally a woman's job, so that is why they got women to come into these factories. And they had a lot of like workforce too, like women were sort of staying at home, young women. Obviously when you got married, well, not obviously to us today, but obviously back then, if you got married, you would be kicked out and you couldn't work here anymore. You had to go stay at home. But again, unsafe kind of conditions there. This is also a good example of those same unsafe conditions. We got little kids working in a factory. And probably the least safe picture here is that man's pants. Look how high up those are. That is not good for him. All right, continuing on with some more effects of the Industrial Revolution. Women, again, are going to be working like we talked about a minute ago, but we're going to see an increased sort of emphasis on this idea of the cult of domesticity, the idea that women are supposed to stay home. Now, for most working class women, that's just not an option, but if you were the sort of goal, if you're a male or a female, was to get to a point where your wife or you could stay home and take care of the kids. That was a big idea. So this domestic idea really translates over into tons of things. The idea that women stay home and work in the home and men work outside the home. So it even applies over to things like voting, for example. Voting was an activity you did outside the home, and it was something that was considered rough and tumble. So the idea that women would vote was something that was a problem for a lot of people to get a hold of. Mass production, the increasing in productivity. Mass culture, more products, is going to lead to more consumerism. So sports are going to become a lot more popular. Baseball in America becomes kind of a working class game. Soccer or football in Britain and other places will become a big working class game there too. Now, one problem, of course, is the environment. A lot of coal smoke and stuff. It became very dangerous. Pollution was a major problem. My hometown of Birmingham, there's descriptions of it in the 30s where there was a sort of like a cloud, basically, of disgusting, dirty coal smoke hanging over it, and made it very difficult to breathe outside. Now, this is not from the time period, but it kind of gives you an idea of the same thing. This is London. This is in the 1950s when they had what's called the Great Fog, I guess. This is during the middle of the day. You can actually see the sun up there in the middle, but you can see how dark it is that even the street lights are on. So while this is not from the 1890s or 1900s, this is something we would see probably very similar, the industrial kind of factories and stuff like that, mixing with some of the rain and stuff that comes in London. It creates this really terrible, terrible fog. Not good for your lungs. Now, not great conditions. So what are people going to do about it? Well, a couple different things. We're going to see some responses to the Industrial Revolution. Harsh conditions led to many people trying many changes. So one example here would be uniting the world through things like philosophies like socialism. Now, before we get there, though, we got labor unions. These allowed workers to have a say in pay and working conditions. They could strike if they were unhappy, so that helped them to make things better. Social reforms, which wanted to take the edge off of the Industrial Revolution. Like, they think it's a good idea, but they realize, like, maybe kids shouldn't be working on these factories, right? So helping with education for people and also banning child labor. Good examples here of some of the dangerous labor union strikes and things. Dangerous really more for the labor union people a lot of times. You can see down right in this one above my head here, you can see the guys with the flags, and then you see the National Guard called out. And oftentimes these could lead to violence on the part of the government or on the part of the strikers. Up there on the top left, hey, thanks, labor union, right? 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. The idea of only an 8-hour workday is something we can thank the unions for. All right, continuing on here, some intellectual reaction to the Industrial Revolution. We got Adam Smith. These are just different people and different philosophies and ideas that people are coming up with. Adam Smith, then, this is a guy we talked about a bunch with the creation of capitalism in his book, The Wealth of Nations. He became more popular due to the rise of capital. Excuse me. Laissez-faire became much more common in the West as well. John Stuart Mill is going to be a champion of social reforms. He will come up with the idea here of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, which makes a lot of sense, I guess, in the sense of like the labor unions, like you shouldn't have to work just for one person who owns everything. Instead, you should maybe think a bit about like what the workers want, right? But also it can be problematic for like minority groups as well. So ups and downs on that one. Socialism, a radical reform that wanted government ownership of factories. So Karl Marx and others would be advocates of this idea. And even anarchism, that the government itself is evil, that we should abolish it, and that property is theft. These are people who are, coming up with pretty radical solutions, quote unquote solutions, that they think would be useful to try to solve these problems. One last little bit here then, let's take a look at 2 countries around the world and sort of their reactions to it. We talked before about how the Ottomans did not do a great job, but after a while they changed their minds a little bit. So Mahmud II, for example, will see the power of Europe and they will seek change. So he will abolish the Janissaries eventually, change taxation. After Mahmud II, the sultans will push a series of reforms known as Tanzimat, which will try to root out corruption. They will increase education, kind of simplify the law codes. This is basically an Ottoman reform edict. So again, early on, we have the Ottomans being very conservative, not getting involved in any sort of industrialization, with the exception of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. But then over time, they realized just how much they've kind of messed up, and then they changed their minds, and they want to bring it in with this Tanzimat. Tanzimat is not incredibly successful. I mean, it's better than it could have been, like if they just kept going like they were doing, but ultimately not, enough to bring the Ottomans out and make them equivalent of a European power. Also in China, we have this thing called the self-strengthening movement. It was designed to make the Chinese more competitive. It came out of this thing called the Opium Wars, which we'll talk more about in the imperialism section, Unit 6, but it's what it sounds like. There were wars fought over the British trying to bring in opium into China. Emperor Guangxu set up 100 days of reform to try to change things and make things better in China. But there's a woman who's the Empress Dowager. She is the one who's really actually in charge, even though he's the emperor. Her name is Dowager. Apologies for my bad pronunciation, but she. And she will oppose these reforms and prevent any of that kind of stuff from happening. So we see a lot of things there going on, lots of changes in this technology, Europeans embracing a lot of these things, a lot of other countries not as well. So the Japanese do to a degree, Ottomans variable, China, so we're seeing a lot of things like that. And that's really going to impact what we're doing when we come around to the next section, which is Unit 6. Now, already way over time here, long video, I want to go ahead and cut that off, but we will see you again on Unit 6, where we will talk a bit about imperialism and where all this leads to. Y'all take care. Thanks a lot.